Let's take an even more scrupulous and careful look at one of the most common, persistent, and unfortunately quite harmful myths about the Great Patriotic War. This myth, ingrained in the minds of many people, claims that the Red Army was able to withstand the onslaught of the Wehrmacht's powerful war machine during the critical period of 1941 to 1942 solely due to massive deliveries of weapons, equipment, and food under the Lend-Lease program. The dissemination and perpetuation of this myth usually serves a very specific purpose: to downplay the colossal, invaluable contributions of the Soviet people and army in the heroic struggle and achievement of the final victory over Nazi Germany, attributing success primarily to external factors, namely aid from the Allies. It is asserted that Lend-Lease tanks, planes, trucks, and other weapons, allegedly appearing at the most critical moment, like a deus ex machina in an ancient tragedy, played a decisive, almost primary role in the defense of Moscow and turned the tide of the battle. But to what extent does this version, so convenient for some historians and publicists, correspond to historical reality? Is it supported by facts and documents? Let's try to impartially understand this issue by referring to reliable historical sources. The Lend-Lease Act, passed by the U.S. Congress on March 11, 1941, did indeed provide for material assistance to countries fighting against the aggressive Axis bloc in World War II. However, initially, during the first year of the program's operation, aid was directed primarily to Great Britain, which was waging a difficult, exhausting struggle against Nazi Germany in Europe, North Africa, and the Atlantic, and to China, which had been courageously resisting Japanese aggression since 1937. The Soviet Union, despite all the difficulties of its situation, was included in the Lend-Lease program much later, only in October 1941, after the treacherous attack by Germany and the beginning of hostilities on Soviet territory. Consequently, the first, still quite modest in volume, deliveries of military equipment, ammunition, food, desperately needed medical equipment, medicines, and strategic raw materials came in the autumn of 1941, when fighting was already fully underway on the territory of the USSR, and the Red Army was suffering enormous, irreplaceable losses. The first batches of British Valentine tanks, supplied under the Lend-Lease program, appeared on the Soviet-German front only in mid-November 1941. When the battle for Moscow was already in full swing, they participated in heavy, grueling defensive battles near Klin, Solnechny-Gorsk, and other sectors of the front, striving to contain the rapid, seemingly unstoppable advance of German troops on the Soviet capital. However, the real influence of these tanks, as well as other Lend-Lease equipment, from the first convoys, on the general course of hostilities, on the overall picture of the confrontation, was extremely limited, practically imperceptible against the background of the general scale of the fighting. It is extremely important to emphasize once again that during this most critical period of the war, when the fate of Moscow, and possibly the entire country, and indeed the whole world, was being decided, the number of imported tanks that entered service with the Red Army constituted a completely negligible percentage of the total number of tanks involved in the battle for Moscow. Their contribution to the defense of the capital, contrary to the widespread myth, was minimal. The battle for Moscow, this Grunga battle, was won primarily thanks to the unbending courage and resilience of Soviet soldiers, the selfless labor of workers and peasants, the enormous exertion of all the country's forces, and the mobilization of all resources. A vivid, one might say textbook, illustration of how few these imported machines were at the initial stage of the war and how poorly, practically not at all, they were familiar to most Soviet soldiers and officers, can be served by the following very revealing and even anecdotal incident. On May 16, 1942, the Central Soviet newspaper Izvestia published a photograph from the battlefield with the caption, "Western Front, the inglorious end of German tanks that tried to break through our forward line of defense." This seemingly completely ordinary publication had very unpleasant and even scandalous consequences. Shortly after the newspaper's release, the editor-in-chief of Izvestia received a call from high authorities and was very sternly pointed out a very annoying, but unfortunately very serious mistake made by the editorial staff. As it turned out, the photograph depicted not a knocked-out German tank, as erroneously stated in the caption under the picture, but a British Matilda tank supplied to the USSR under the Lend-Lease program, knocked out by German troops. This seemingly minor incident had far-reaching and very unpleasant political consequences for the Soviet side. The article in Izvestia caused a real stir and a violent reaction not only in the USSR itself, but also far abroad. Goebbels' propaganda machine, naturally, did not fail to take advantage of this incident for its own purposes. German propaganda, with its inherent energy, began to actively exaggerate this topic, spreading information everywhere that the Russians were allegedly unable to effectively resist German tanks and therefore, to maintain the morale of the population and create the appearance of success, they passed off British Matilda tanks knocked out by the Wehrmacht as their own trophies. Similar publications, readily picking up this disinformation, also appeared in the press of some neutral countries, which undoubtedly damaged the international prestige and image of the Soviet Union and undermined confidence in Soviet propaganda. Subscribe to our channel, to stay up to date on new interesting facts about World War II and have the opportunity to hear different, sometimes diametrically opposed, points of view on key historical events. As a result of this scandal, the Soviet leadership had to make considerable diplomatic efforts to mitigate the negative consequences of this incident and restore the trust of the Allies. Official explanations were given and apologies were made to representatives of the British Embassy in Moscow. And an official refutation of the ill-fated article that caused such a wide and undesirable international scandal was published. This whole incident very eloquently and clearly demonstrates how insignificant and practically imperceptible was the share of foreign armored equipment supplied under Lend-Lease in the Red Army during the initial, most difficult period of the war. If we turn to dry but impartial statistics, the share of Lend-Lease tanks in the total number of Red Army tanks during the entire Great Patriotic War was only 3%, and aircraft, 13%. These modest figures unequivocally and convincingly indicate that the main burden of the fighting, the main burden of the war, was borne by equipment produced in the Soviet Union itself, and not supplied from abroad under the Lend-Lease program. This is an undeniable fact that must be taken into account when assessing the USSR's contribution to victory. When discussing Lend-Lease and its role in the Great Patriotic War, it is extremely important to consider another factor, often overlooked, namely the logistics of deliveries. It was only possible to significantly increase the volume of deliveries to the USSR from the USA, Great Britain, and Canada by 1943, after the creation, and no less importantly, more or less established appropriate logistical infrastructure, port facilities, transport communications, warehouses, etc., until that moment. Especially during the critically important period of 1941 to 1942, the volume of deliveries under Lend-Lease was very limited, which was due to a number of objective reasons. One of the main reasons for these limitations was the high activity of the German Navy and Air Force in the Northern Seas, through which sea convoys with cargo for the USSR passed. At the beginning of 1942, German surface ships, submarines, and aircraft of the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe posed a very serious threat to Allied convoys heading to the northern ports of the Soviet Union, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The losses of Allied cargo ships carrying military materials and food were very significant, which made these deliveries extremely risky and expensive, and the capacity of the northern route remained extremely low. A striking and tragic example is the fate of Arctic convoy PQ-17, dispatched in the summer of 1942 and consisting of 35 cargo ships. As a result of massive attacks by German submarines and aircraft, 22 cargo ships and 2 auxiliary vessels of the convoy were sunk. and most of the cargo was lost. This seriously limited the possibilities of Lend-Lease deliveries, especially during the critical initial period of the war, when the Soviet Union desperately needed any assistance. As a consequence of all these difficulties and limitations, at the most difficult and critical moments of the war, when the outcome of the most important battles was being decided, the Battle for Moscow, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Grand Battle of Kursk, the Battle of the Dnieper, the Soviet Union had to rely primarily on its own forces, its own resources, the mobilization potential of its economy, and, of course, the unbending courage and heroism of its soldiers and officers. And the entire Soviet people, Lend-Lease assistance during these periods was undoubtedly important and useful. It contributed to the common cause of fighting Nazism, but did not play a decisive, crucial role. This needs to be clearly understood. Perhaps the most noticeable and tangible for the Red Army were the deliveries of vehicles under Lend-Lease, primarily American Studebaker US-6 trucks, which were highly appreciated by Soviet drivers for their reliability and cross-country ability. The total number of vehicles delivered throughout the war reached an impressive figure: 375,000. However, here too, it must be remembered that this is the total figure for the entire period of the war, and not for 1941 to 1942, as of January 1st, 1942. According to official data from the main Automobile Directorate of the Red Army, the vast majority, 99.6%, of the Soviet Union's vehicle fleet consisted of domestic vehicles, GZA, ZS-5 trucks, and so on. Only the remaining 0.4% were previously purchased imported vehicles, not equipment supplied under Lend-Lease. If we look at the data as of January 1st, 1943, 6 months before the start of the grandiose battle on the Kursk Bulge, we will see that the share of Soviet vehicles in the Red Army still amounted to 93.7%. The influx of Lend-Lease transport was still relatively small, and only by 1945, when the outcome of the war was practically predetermined, did the share of imported vehicles increase significantly, reaching 30%. This indicates that the decisive battles of the war were won mainly with domestic equipment. A similar picture was observed with practically all types of aid provided to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program: gunpowder, various types of strategic raw materials, including extremely important petroleum products and non-ferrous metals, food, equipment for factories, and other important materials and goods. Lend-Lease undoubtedly contributed to the common cause of fighting Nazism, eased the situation of the Soviet economy and army, but did not determine the overall picture of the supply of the Red Army and Soviet industry as a whole. It was an important but not a decisive factor. It cannot be denied that any assistance from the Allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, in the fight against a common enemy, was valuable and important. However, to categorically assert that it was thanks to Lend-Lease and not thanks to the heroism of the Soviet people and the power of Soviet industry, that the Red Army was able to compensate for the colossal, unprecedented material losses of the catastrophic initial period of the war and withstand, and then defeat, the Wehrmacht's most powerful offensive is to be deeply mistaken, to distort historical truth, and to unfairly downplay the titanic efforts and innumerable sacrifices of the Soviet people. The USSR, having mobilized all its human and material resources, demonstrating unprecedented courage, resilience, and heroism, managed in a historically short time not only to restore but also to significantly increase the production of military products at surviving and newly built enterprises, as well as at enterprises evacuated from the enemy-occupied western regions of the country to the Urals, Siberia, and the Volga region. Thanks to this, the vast majority of weapons, military equipment, ammunition, fuels, and lubricants, and food supplied to the Red Army throughout the Great Patriotic War were produced in the Soviet Union itself. The share of imported supplies, including supplies under the Lend-Lease program, was relatively small and did not play a decisive role in achieving victory. This is a historical fact that must be remembered. Don't forget to leave your comment, like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new interesting videos. See you next time.